My Night on the Ozark Highland Hiking Trail by Dangitjimmy. Look, this isn't a Bigfoot story, so if that's what you're looking for, move on. I only wish that what I experienced that night was a giant, hairy, bipedal ape. Maybe then I could rationalize it in my head that I'd only seen a bear or be able to move on with my life. If only it were that simple. It was Thanksgiving break in the fall of '89 and I was 19. And in my sophomore year at the University of Arkansas. All of my friends were headed home for the week, but home didn't seem like an option for me right now, but that's not what this story's about. It had been a particularly rough couple of months, and quite frankly, I wasn't in the Thanksgiving mood. The thought of being surrounded by family, by anyone for that matter, seemed incredibly claustrophobic. I needed the outdoors and the solitude. I'd never gone on a hike in my life. I'd grown up hunting and camping in the natural state, so I was familiar with the wilderness. But starting at point A and walking to point B never really interested me, not until now anyway. On many of my drives home down Scenic Highway 23, or the Pig Trail as we referred to it, I'd seen the crossing of the Ozark Highland hiking trail, but had never really given it a second thought. Now, however, it was almost audibly calling my name. A few days earlier, I'd bought a map of the Ozarks, which showed several different hiking trails, and I plotted out my course. This was way before GPS and smartphones. The plan was to drop my car off at the Pig Trail crossing and have my roommate take me further up the trail on his way home. It wasn't too far off of his way and he didn't mind. Like I said, we didn't have GPS or cell phones then, but I was a 19-year-old guy in great shape and I was going to live forever. So I never gave it a second thought. In my mind, all I needed was my map, a compass, some food, water, a tent, a sleeping bag, and I was set. I couldn't wait to get out into the open air, away from my school, and away from, well, everybody. So on Saturday morning, we left the dorms around 10 o'clock, deposited my car on 23, and I was at my starting point, a couple of miles north of the little town of Ozark sometime before noon. It was a brisk and beautiful fall day in the Ozark Mountains, and life was good again. The total expedition took me around 25 miles, so I figured it would take me about 3 days max. But I wasn't in a hurry. I had plenty of food and there were multiple creeks along the way, so if it took the entire week, well, it wouldn't bother me one bit. The first day was great. I took it real slow, making my way around and down a mountain towards this valley. It was just what I needed. Everything was perfect right up until about 30 minutes after making camp. I'd stopped at the base of the valley, where the trail crossed the little Mulberry Creek. It was a great spot. I built a small fire and set up my tent. I'd just settled back to enjoy the sunset when a group of 4 guys arrived and made camp about 50 yards away. It wasn't too bad until they turned on their CD player. Really? Why would you come out into nature only to turn on your stereo? After about the 3rd time through Bobby McFerrin's Don't Worry, Be Happy, I was about ready to pull my hair out. The next morning, I was up and out before my neighbors began to stir. I didn't want to run the risk of being anywhere near them while I hiked. Again, it was another wonderful day. The beauty of the Ozarks at this time of the year is something to see. They're not really mountains per se, more like giant, rolling, covered hills. When the leaves change in the fall, it's simply spectacular. By the time I reached my next planned camping site, Indian Creek, it was getting close to dusk. I could have walked a little further, but then again, I wasn't in a hurry to get back and I'd much rather be near water overnight. I surveyed the surroundings and I picked a spot, but recalling the previous night's futility, I looked up the creek. I didn't want to run the risk of a repeat if those guys were still on the trail. So I decided to follow it north, away from the trail. I picked up my backpack and started walking at a brisker pace. I wanted to get as far out of earshot as possible before sunset. I guessed I'd gone about 2.5 miles before finding a nice, cozy spot near the creek. Being in another valley, the sun was already behind the mountain, but I still had enough light to finish camp. By the time the fire was going good, the stars were shining bright in a cloudless sky. framing a perfectly full moon. The night was glorious. It seemed late, but it couldn't have been much past 10 o'clock when I gave in to the drowsiness, and I crawled inside the tent. I'm not sure what time I stirred, but the fire was nothing more than a few glowing embers, so it must have been several hours later. It wasn't anything specific that woke me up, nothing aside from the absolute stillness of the night. It had been somewhat breezy before turning in, with the crickets chirping loudly, but now there was nothing. Even the trickling creek directly outside seemed muted. This was the first moment I can recall any bit of uneasiness creeping over me. My stomach tingled with a slight touch of anxiety as I poked my head out of the tent. It was so quiet and bright. Without the fire illuminating the camp, the moon and the stars could bathe the creek bed in their light. I crawled the rest of the way out and sat up to listen, ever so faintly. Further north, I could just barely make it out. A baby crying. Out here? Could there be a house somewhere way out here? Maybe another family of hikers. It seemed unlikely, and the sounds here could travel quite a distance in the night. Maybe it was further than I thought. I sat and I listened. Surely, if there was a house nearby, the baby's mother would come to comfort the child. The crying continued, growing more distinct. Now, I'd worked the night shift buffing floors at the local hospital, and I'd been up in the labor and delivery ward. I knew what it sounded like when a baby was hungry or fussy, and I knew what it sounded like when they stuck one of them with a needle. It was a distinctly different sounding cry. This was a needle-sticking cry. Something wasn't right. I've read studies about what the sound of a baby crying does to someone, even to cats and dogs. It unleashes this primal need to, for lack of a better phrase, do something about it. I didn't know about that then, but looking back now, I do. Instincts were pulling me to respond. Gradually, I rose and grabbed my flashlight. I quickly discovered that I could see better without the light on, so I attached the strap to my belt loop and continued north. The crying grew louder and more urgent the further I went. I was getting close. The creek ahead disappeared around a bend to the right, but I could tell I was now standing between the water and the baby. I could see a slight opening in the brush that looked to be an old pathway. If not for the cries of the baby, I would easily assume that it was just another game trail. I summoned all the courage I could muster and plowed ahead through the brush. With each step that I took, my sense of trepidation grew. Just as I started to reach for my light, the brush around me began to open up. Desperate cries pounded my head as I jogged faster towards the opening up ahead. When I broke through, I was standing at the edge of a small clearing. The moonlight revealed a small, rugged shack about 40 yards ahead in the opposite side. It had to be a single-room cabin, with a stone chimney on the left and a rusted tin roof as cover. Its lone, front-facing window was pitch black. In the air hung the stench of hard-grain alcohol and hate. I shuddered. About halfway between the shack and me, off to the right sat an old water well that looked even older than the house. The walls were made from stone, like that of the shack's chimney, and there were what appeared to be old railroad ties on either side, which supported a wooden spool over the shaft. A hand crank stuck out from its side, and old rope wrapped the spool, but there was no bucket at its end. The well didn't appear to have been used in a very long time. The cries jolted me back to the moment. The thought of approaching that shack flooded me with absolute terror. Something evil was inside that house, but the baby's shrieks intensified as I wheeled my feet onward. I had taken only a few steps when the realization hit me like a lead weight. The screaming wasn't coming from the shack. It echoed up from the depths of that well. Suddenly, a woman burst through the cabin door, sending me to my knees in fright. Her tattered, dingy plaid dress billowed behind her as she sprinted towards the crying infant. "Lily May!" Her shrieks pierced my ears. She continued to wail until she reached the well. Again, she sobbed, "Lily May!" now into the well's mouth. I somehow managed to find my feet, and with trembling legs, I tried my best to move ahead. I staggered towards her, but by the time I got there, she'd already wrapped the rope around her waist and tied it off. "Ma'am," I shouted. "Ma'am, let me help." But she was already over the edge before I could stop her. The wooden spool squealed and shook as she descended. Looking down into the shaft, all I could see was a few feet of rope and then black nothingness. The cry was even more amplified as I stood directly above. Then the screeching spool by my head stopped abruptly. "Ma'am, I'll pull you out. Just let me know when you're..." A door slammed from behind me, freezing me in place. The stench of moonshine reeked in the air, and it overwhelmed me. I turned to look, and there he stood on the porch. I tried to move, to yell out in fear, but my body betrayed me and didn't budge. He was a large man, wearing an old, worn-out, sweat-stained coveralls. Even if the midday sun shone bright, the original color of which could not have been known. His boots and hat matched the dirty brown look. Moonlight glistened off his sweaty, unshaven face, while greasy streaks of dirt pulled in the wrinkles around his neck. My attention was drawn to what he held in his right hand, an old, well-worn wooden hatchet. I couldn't move a muscle as he methodically stepped off the porch and moved towards the well, towards me. With each deliberate step that he took, the air pressure surrounding me dropped. It was like I was in a vacuum with all of the air being sucked out and replaced with hate. The cries from below grew louder, as if they were inside my very head. I struggled to breathe, but the stench of sweat and liquor choked my lungs. He was mere feet from me now. As he raised the hatchet high in the air, I resigned myself to my fate. This was my end. As the hatchet came down, instinct overcame terror, and I dropped to all fours. The sound of iron on wood echoed through the valley. I looked up. He towered over me, arm and hand still attached to the hatchet, attached to the spool. In one blow, he'd driven the tool deep into the wood, severing the rope and sending it down deep into the bowels of the earth. The baby's cries had diminished now, in what I can only guess were the comforting arms of her mother. They were only to be replaced by the mother's screams of desperation. The man never acknowledged my existence. He turned back towards the shack and moved away at the same pace in which he had came. My eyes followed him as he went, but he softly faded away before his foot hit the porch. I instantly became aware of my labored breath, aware of the sound of my heart resounding in my head. Sweat dripped from my nose. I was drenched. I looked back again, and the shack was gone. Only a solitary stone fireplace stood there now. I struggled to my feet to find the well was different too. The wooden beams and the winch had gone now, and a rusty metal lid sealed off the top. I could still hear the faint sobs from the mother beneath the steel sarcophagus, but even that was faded now. And then there was silence. A gentle breeze touched my face for the first time in what seemed like ages, as I was suddenly cold. The trees rustled awake as a gust of wind rushed through the valley, breathing life back into the forest. A single cricket chirped back to life, signaling the rest that it was okay to sing again. I wasn't the only witness that night. They had seen it too. I'm not sure how long it took for me to stumble back to my camp, but by the time I sat down, the sun was just breaking over the crest of the valley. I must have sat there shaking for at least another hour. I was back to my car before the following sunset. When I turned onto the highway, I headed south, for home. It was the only option now. I wanted to see my mother, to tell her that I was sorry. If you search the internet for Ghost Mountain, Arkansas, you'll find the story of how on a moonlit night in the 1930s, a drunken man threw a sick child into a well. You'll read that after his hysterical wife went in after it, he cut the rope she'd used and left them there to die. And how on certain nights when the moon is full, you can still hear the mother's screams and the cries from that baby emanating from the belly of that well. Now mind you, the internet won't give you the exact location. It only speaks in generalities. and it tells you to talk to the locals. The problem is, they're not looking in the right place. I've visited that well many nights in my sweat-soaked dreams. I've heard the mother scream, seen that terrible man. I'll never be rid of them. I've since married and divorced. I told my wife weeks into our relationship that I never wanted children. She said she was okay with that. She lied. Years later, she begged. She asked, "Why don't you want children? I've seen you with them. You'd be a great father." I'd answer, "No, never. I told you from the beginning, I don't want children. I don't like them." That was also a lie. I love children. I desperately want one of my own. The simple truth of the matter is, I can't. The crying child inside my head that wakes me up in the middle of the night, that's bad enough. I think a real one, night after night, would push me over sanity's edge, would push my mind back into that night, back to the bottom of that well, never again to see the light of day.